Hello, back again. Gluttons for punishment. No spoons this week. Can you see? Can you see? Something really rather wonderful, and I'll show it to you there. And it's, I think, one of the most decorative and attractive forms in 18th century silver, which is the punch strainer. Sometimes called lemon strainers, sometimes called orange strainers, but they are basically when the Georgians and earlier concocted these horrible, sort of milk-based punches with all sorts of flotsam and jetsam in them. Before you were forced to drink it, they would strain out any lumps or bumps in your glass under there. They'd ladle it through, and then you'd whip those back into the punch bowl for some poor unsuspecting soul to get another dose of. Not a great fan of punch, as you can tell, but it did leave us with these wonderful things, and you can see the work in them. If I breathe on this, see the beautiful decorative piercing. The later 18th century ones, you will just often get concentric bands of piercing. These earlier ones you either get, because this is provincially made, just simple dot piercing but in an attractive pattern, and some of the London ones have beautiful sort of cut card pierced work with scrolls and Arcadian devices and figures and all manner of things. They can be extremely decorative, very much like the piercing. Specialist piercers did this work that's done on the top of casters of the same period. This was in a sale a few years ago, and it was catalogued as being made in London, which piqued my interest because I saw it had 4 maker's marks struck in the bottom of the bowl. And you should know by now that if you get more than 1 maker's mark repeatedly struck on a piece of silver, there's a very good chance it's going to be provincial, which this indeed was. This is a West Country strainer, which is an enormously rare thing, of a very early period. This was made between 1711 and 1720, and the maker's mark is for Henry Tolcher, and I'll put a picture up of that mark so you can see it on Instagram, and he was working in Plymouth. So even rarer than Exeter, it is a Plymouth strainer of the early 18th century in fabulous condition. But it was a bit of a mystery. I showed it to a couple of people, and they said, oh, it's a beautiful, beautiful piece of silver. And it really is. The colour of it is fantastic. The condition of it is wonderful. And then one person asked me, he said, oh, that's very interesting. He said, why has it got a Britannia mark on the handle? And I said, well, it's Britannia silver, because this is Henry Tolcher's Britannia standard silver mark. And just so we know what Britannia silver is, between 1697 and 1720, to stop, or not to stop, but to discourage people immediately taking coinage and turning it into objects, and then there's less currency about, the government of the day decided that the standard of wrought silver objects had to be higher than that of the coinage. It had to be 958 parts per thousand, whereas sterling silver is 925 parts per thousand. The reason it was 958 parts is because that equates to 23 carat gold. So it is in effect 23 carat silver. That's why it's thought that's why they chose that that weight of silver. It all meant there was more expense. You couldn't just convert coinage into objects and back again. It meant you had to add pure silver. It made it more costly. It made it more difficult. It was effectively a speed bump to stop you very quickly changing all your money into wrought plate. And it lasted until 1720. And in 1720, you were allowed to make sterling silver again. But you could also, people think that for some reason that Britannia then didn't exist, but it did. The two standards then existed from that point onwards, but you weren't legally obliged to make anything in the higher Britannia standard, but you could still choose to do so. So we're back to this, and somebody said, why has it got a Britannia mark there and no other marks, and Henry Tolcher's mark 4 times in the bowl? And I paused for a moment, and I had to say that thing that I really don't like to say. I said, I don't know. And with that, I went away to think about it and put this away, and have thought about it on various occasions since, and not really gotten to the bottom of it until I had a slight flash of inspiration and realised that Mr. Tolcher was a very enterprising goldsmith indeed. You'll notice in assay office books, in ledgers, that often when objects are submitted for assay, they are done so in an incomplete state. So, for instance, if you had a cup and cover with a foot, you may submit the cup and cover and the foot, but you might submit those objects before they are soldered all together and to be assayed. So you will get that. You will particularly get it in some provincial centres. There are records of it happening in the early part of the 19th century in York, and I'm sure it happened elsewhere. And that led me to the realisation that, sadly, a lot of the silver that was made, even 200 or 300 years ago, has gone. We are looking at fragments and survivors, which gives us a slightly skewed view of what was made originally and how abundant things were. So I will look at that, and I think most people that collect West Country silver will look at that and go, oh my goodness, what a rarity that is. But it's the West Country. Everybody liked to drink in the West Country. And actually, what to us now is a very rare form from any provincial centre will have been made in reasonably large numbers. And once you realise that, once you realise that Henry Tolcher wouldn't just be asked to make one of these a year, but might be asked to make a dozen, and that pieces could be submitted before they were completely finished together, you get to the answer of this conundrum, which I find quite charming, really. And that was that had they all survived, there would be 2 other strainers by Henry Tolcher to go with this one. One other would have 4 marks in the bowl, and it would just have one handle with a Britannia mark on, as this has. And then there would be one that had Henry Tolcher's mark with a full set of Exeter Assay Office marks here. But there would be no marks on the handles. Maybe you've now worked it out. Because what Tolcher did was he submitted one strainer to the assay office, 1 bowl and 2 handles. Whether it was assembled together like this or whether it was in parts is debatable, but he submitted it and they duly marked it. Full marks in the bowl and part marks on the handle, because they tested it and it was all Britannia silver. And then Tolcher went back to his workshop and thought, I have a cunning plan. And he made 2 more bowls out of sterling silver, the lower standard. He made 2 more handles out of sterling silver, the lower standard. And he took the Britannia handle, the sterling bowl and the sterling handle, another Britannia handle, a sterling bowl and a sterling handle, and then a Britannia bowl and 2 sterling handles. And he sold 3 hallmarked Britannia lemon or punch strainers as Britannia silver. And the difference in the quantity of silver was his additional profit. It was a ruse of tremendous cunning, but it did happen. All over the country, goldsmiths were trying to get round what they felt was an onerous legislation and afforded them the opportunity to make a few more shillings. And we might think, well, that's not going to be a fortune. But if your working and living is purely the selling of silver, the manufacturing and selling of silver, and you can make a few extra pence on everything you sell each year, that quickly mounts up. And of course, we would know that immediately if everything that Henry Tolcher ever made survived. But of course it didn't, because these things became, it's too big for a teacup. These things became quite useless, and they were melted down, and they were refashioned, or they were lost, or they were broken. This one survives and tells, I think, a much more interesting tale than had Tolcher just been honest and upfront about it. Extremely rare thing. Sort of available. Sort of. Wheelbarrows of money would need to be involved. This is, if you need to see what we mean by colour on a piece of early silver and skin and surface, just take a moment to look at that. That is as the day it was made, and it is over 300 years old and made in Plymouth, and it is glorious. And there are bigger things than this in museums. There are bigger bits of Exeter silver, much bigger. There aren't much better than this. And I have warmed to Mr. Tolcher enormously, and his tricksy ways. So there we go. That was a mystery that took me far too long to solve. It took me a couple of years to work that one out. But I'm getting slower as I'm getting older. But glad to show it to you, as ever. I'll try and find something as interesting, more interesting, less interesting, possibly less interesting, to show you next week. But until then, goodbye and good antiques hunting.